The ballroom had gone quiet in the particular way it only did when something irreversible was about to happen. Miriam Ashby stood at the top of the marble staircase with the Vane rubies at her throat, and she stood there long enough that every face in the room below turned upward toward her. The rubies caught the light of 400 candles and threw it back in fragments. Red, gold, red. She had not worn jewels in 8 months. She had not owned any. And yet there they were, warm against her skin, the clasp at the back of her neck as familiar as her own pulse, because they had always been hers, because the whole machinery of what had been done to her had depended on her not knowing that. And she had found it out anyway, quietly, at a kitchen table, one letter at a time. Across the ballroom, the Earl of Vane stood very still. He was not a man who moved without purpose, and he did not move now. His face gave nothing away, as it never did. But his hands at his sides closed slowly, one finger at a time, until both were fists against his coat. He had been told, Miriam knew, that the rubies were gone. He had been told she had taken them. He had believed it, or something inside him had chosen to believe it. And she had spent 8 months in a rented room on the edge of the parish, learning to live inside the weight of that. She had not come tonight to be forgiven. She had come to show them all what she already knew. There are women the season decides to overlook, and there are women it decides to make an example of. Miriam had been both inside a single year. She had arrived in London the previous autumn as a lady's companion to Lady Dorothea Fenn, a widow of gentle means and considerable social confidence who had taken Miriam on as an act of Christian charity and reminded her of it approximately once per morning. The position was not what Miriam had been raised to expect. Her father had been a clergyman of modest income and fierce intellectual ambition, and Miriam had grown up reading Latin at a table where dinner was often thin, but the conversation was not. She was 23 years old. She was well-read, methodical, and deeply unfashionable in the particular way of women who have spent their childhood in a country parsonage and arrived in London without knowing that everything they had been taught to value was invisible here. The season saw her and wrote her off in 3 days. Lady Fenn's drawing room, the second afternoon of Miriam's employment, had supplied the first verdict. Lady Fenn's cousin, a Mrs. Alderton of considerable jewels and no particular inner life, had looked Miriam over during the tea service and said, pleasantly, to no one in particular, "The companion. How useful for Dorothea. A kind of domestic fixture, really." The remark was not addressed to Miriam. It was not addressed to anyone. It landed in the room and settled there, the way such remarks do. And Miriam had filled the next cup without looking up, and had smiled at the elderly baronet beside her, and had felt the words settle into the particular layer of her chest where such things accumulate and compact themselves into something harder than grief. The Earl of Vane had been in that room. He had arrived with his grandmother, the Dowager Countess of Vane, a woman of 64, whose social confidence was a thing of architectural beauty, and he had stood near the window with his tea cooling in his hand, and said nothing for the better part of an hour. Miriam had noticed him the way one notices a stone pillar, as something fixed in a space that otherwise moved too much. His grandmother had positioned herself at Lady Fenn's right hand and managed the conversation like a general managing troop movements. The Earl had watched. Miriam had watched him watching just for a moment before she looked away. What Miriam did not know, sitting in that drawing room with her plain gray dress and her careful posture, was that the Earl of Vane had also been watching her. He had watched her refill Mrs. Alderton's cup without flinching at the remark. He had watched her steady the saucer of an elderly gentleman who was shaking with cold, catching it with both hands before the man had registered the tilt, so smoothly that no one noticed the correction had been needed. He had watched her quietly move a vase of flowers so that the oldest woman in the room, seated in the corner behind a pillar, would have a better view of the garden. She had done it by redirecting the footman with a word, low and precise, so that the arrangement appeared to have been an oversight corrected rather than a small act of noticing she had no authority to perform. None of it was performed for anyone's benefit. None of it was seen by the room. It was simply what she did, one small act after another, the way a person does who has learned that worth must be spent, whether or not anyone is watching. He did not speak to her that afternoon. She did not expect him to. If you have been reading carefully, you may already sense what the season could not. Stay with Miriam a little longer. The Dowager Countess of Vane was a woman who had been socially decisive for 40 years and had never once been wrong about anything. In her own estimation, she had chosen every significant match in the Vane family for 2 generations. She had planned her grandson's future wife when the girl was still in the schoolroom, settling on Lady Cecily Peel, the daughter of a marquis, as the correct alliance, the correct family, the correct weight of diamonds. Lady Cecily was beautiful in the way of a well-appointed room, with everything placed precisely, nothing excessive, nothing missing. She had been trained since childhood to be exactly what she appeared to be, and the Dowager found this deeply reassuring. Edmund Vane had not objected. He had not agreed. He had moved through the first weeks of the season with the quality of attention he applied to everything, complete and yielding nothing. He was 34 years old, and he had been cold, not unkind, and not cruel, but cold, for the better part of 3 years. The coldness had a shape that those who knew him could name. It had arrived with his wife's death in the autumn of 1812, a fever that had taken Clara Vane in 6 days, while Edmund had ridden hard through the night to reach the county house and arrived 4 hours too late. He had held her hand after. That was the fact he could not unhook from himself. He had held her hand after, in the dark, and had sat with her until morning, and had never in the years since spoken her name to anyone who had not already known her. He kept her miniature in his breast pocket. He had kept it so long that the enamel case was worn smooth on one side, the painted face of a woman with light brown hair and a serious expression becoming less distinct each year, as if she were slowly taking leave of the world through his own handling. He did not take the miniature out in company. He did not refer to it. He simply carried it. And anyone who noticed the habit of his hand going occasionally to the left breast of his coat knew what it meant, and understood without requiring it to be explained that the Earl of Vane was a man whose wound was private, specific, and deep enough to have restructured everything above it. This was what lived inside his coldness. It was not arrogance, it was not indifference, it was grief, worn so long that it had become a way of standing in a room. Miriam did not know any of this when Lady Fenn accepted the Dowager's invitation to dine at Vane House in the 3rd week of November. The dinner was formal, lavish, and uncomfortable in the particular way of evenings designed to demonstrate something rather than to enjoy anything. The Dowager had arranged the table so that Lady Cecily was placed at Edmund's right hand, and Miriam was placed at the far end beside an elderly baronet, who had discovered he was deaf at approximately the age of 50 and had since been perfectly content to simply smile at everything. Miriam had eaten her soup and admired the table silver, and watched, from a distance of 18 feet, the Dowager maneuver Lady Cecily into a story about her accomplishments that was long and graceful and designed to be overheard. The rubies, she noticed, were not at the Dowager's throat that evening. The Dowager wore pearls. Something in the absence registered, briefly, and then Miriam's attention was claimed by the baronet. who had discovered he was capable of hearing certain low frequencies, and was delighted to discover that Miriam's speaking register fell within them. After dinner, while the women withdrew and the men took their port, Miriam had found herself briefly alone in the library. She had not gone to look at anything. She had gone because the withdrawing room was very warm and the corridor outside was not, and she had stood for 3 minutes with her back against the library door, and her eyes closed and her hands flat against the cool wood, allowing herself a moment that was not available to her anywhere else in the house. The smell of the room was paper and leather, and a faint trace of candle smoke, and it was not dissimilar to the smell of her father's study on winter evenings, and she had let herself feel that for 3 minutes before she would return to the correct performance of a woman who required nothing. When she opened her eyes, Edmund Vane was standing 4 feet away. He had a book in his hand that he clearly had not come to retrieve. He was watching her with an expression she could not name. Not the social blank he wore in every other room, but something that held a quality of intent she had never been the subject of before. Not from anyone. Not like this. She was conscious of the warmth of the room, and of his stillness, and of the distance between them, as a thing that existed. "I did not hear you come in," she said. "I did not intend to disturb you," he said. His voice was low and level. "You looked as though you were thinking." "I was recovering," she said, before she had decided to say it. "Your grandmother's table requires considerable stamina." Something moved in his face. Not a smile. The shadow of a smile, perhaps, or the space where one might eventually live. "She would be gratified to hear it," he said. "I suspect she would," Miriam said. "She strikes me as someone who is satisfied when her arrangements produce the response she intended." He looked at her. It was a direct look, the kind she had not expected, and he said, "You are more observant than you are permitted to show at her table." The words were precise. They named something she had not named aloud, and she felt the accuracy of them as a small shock, the way one feels when someone confirms a thing one had assumed was invisible. "I was not aware it showed at all," she said. "Only to someone looking," he said. She held that for a moment. Outside the library, the murmur of the withdrawing room was audible, soft and continuous, and the light was very warm, and she had looked at him for a moment too long. She knew it. He knew it. She turned toward the door and said, "I should return." And he said, "Yes," and neither of them moved for another 3 seconds, which was 3 seconds more than propriety permitted. She returned to the withdrawing room. He returned to the dining room. The dowager, who noticed everything, had noticed that her grandson had been absent from the port for longer than he should have been, and had looked at Miriam when she entered the withdrawing room with an expression that had no generosity in it. The following week, the rubies disappeared. The Vane rubies were a set of 4 pieces, a necklace, a pair of earrings, a brooch, and a ring, all matched stones set in gold filigree, brought to England in the previous century, and housed in a velvet case in the dowager's personal dressing room at Vane House. They had been counted and referenced in estate inventories. Their value was considerable. They were found to be missing on a Tuesday morning. The dowager's personal maid reported it. The household was searched. The solicitor arrived. 2 days of careful, correct, devastating inquiry produced a single point of conclusion. On the evening of the dinner, when the ladies had briefly been unattended in the upstairs withdrawing room, Miriam Ashby, lady's companion of 8 months' standing and no family of consequence, had been observed by the dowager's own maid to carry a small, dark reticule from the guest wing to the upper staircase. Miriam had carried a reticule. It had contained a handkerchief and a small bottle of hartshorn. The maid had not been asked what it contained. The maid had been asked what it looked like. And it looked like a reticule large enough to carry a velvet case. Lady Fenn had dismissed Miriam from her employment that same afternoon. She had done it in 3 sentences, from across the width of the morning room, without quite looking at Miriam directly, because looking at the thing one is doing makes it harder to complete it quickly, and Lady Fenn had always preferred to be quick about difficult things. Edmund Vane had said nothing. He had stood in his own hallway while the solicitor spoke, and his face had been the carved stone of a man who had decided what to believe, and decided it quickly. And Miriam, pulling her cloak over her arms in the entrance hall below, had looked up one time to where he stood on the landing, and he had looked back at her, and he had said nothing. She had understood then that he had chosen to believe it. She had walked out of Vane House into a gray November morning and had not looked back. The months that followed were not easy to describe, and Miriam did not often try. She had a small amount of savings. She had her father's books and her own methodical mind and the ability to give lessons in French and Italian to the daughters of households that did not yet know her name or could not afford to care about it. She had, in the end, managed. She had eaten and kept herself warm and paid for the reglazing of one window when the draft became unworkable, though the second window she had managed with a carefully folded piece of oilcloth through January and into February. She had given lessons 6 days a week and had read in the evenings and had written letters on Sunday afternoons, because there was nothing else to do on Sunday afternoons, and because the act of writing things down had always helped her think. The lodgings were on the 4th floor of a house whose landlady was a Mrs. Portman, a woman of 50 with a sharp eye for character and an indifference to reputation that Miriam found more useful than any other quality she might have had. Mrs. Portman had heard, from the network through which such things travel in London, a version of the accusation. She had looked at Miriam over her reading spectacles when Miriam first presented herself and said, "I don't know what you did or didn't do. What I know is you pay your rent on time, and you don't make noise after 9, and those are the only qualities I have ever required." Miriam had thanked her and paid the first month in advance, and had felt, for the first time since November, the particular relief of being located somewhere outside the season's jurisdiction. She had thought a great deal in those 8 months. She had thought about the remark in Lady Fenn's drawing room, and the nature of the word fixture, and the way the season had looked at her and located nothing of value, and the way Edmund Vane had looked at her in a library and located something else entirely. She did not permit herself to think about that too often. It led nowhere useful. It did not change the practical facts of a woman of 23 with no family and no position and a charge of theft that had never been formally made, because formal charges required evidence, and the evidence had been arranged to suggest without proving, which was a more efficient form of damage than proof would have been. There were mornings, the cold ones mostly, when the unglazed window let in enough air to make the room feel provisional, in a way that no amount of additional blankets entirely corrected. And on those mornings Miriam sat on the edge of her narrow bed and held the fact of her situation in both hands and simply looked at it. She was not a woman given to self-pity. Her father had raised her to understand that self-pity is a luxury that consumes the resources one actually needs for the work at hand, and she believed him. There is a kind of looking that is not self-pity, and is not grief, and is not resignation. That is simply the honest accounting of what has happened to a person and what that person still has left to work with. She did this accounting on cold mornings. She always found the same things in the accounting: her mind, her father's books, the small fire she could afford to keep going for 3 hours each evening, and the specific fact that she was not wrong about the rubies. She was not wrong. Someone had arranged for her to look as though she were, and the difference between arrangement and truth was, in the end, a matter of evidence, and evidence was something she understood how to find. What she could not accept, even in the 8th month of the rented room, was the theft itself. Not because she feared prison, though she feared it. Not because she feared permanent poverty, though it pressed on her. It was not because she was a thief, because she was not one, and somewhere inside the structure of herself that her father had built with Latin texts and hard winters and careful attention, she knew that bearing the charge silently was not the same as bearing it with dignity. Dignity required a response. Dignity required evidence. And Miriam had the kind of mind that did not stop moving when things became difficult. It moved differently. It became more methodical. It began to write things down. If you are wondering how she managed it, so were the people in that ballroom. Keep watching. She had begun by writing down everything she remembered of the night of the dinner, working through who had been where, when, and for how long. She had written it at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she had let go cold, working through it twice, and then a third time from a different sequence. Because sometimes the shape of a thing changes when you approach it from the other side. She was looking for the thing that did not fit. What did not fit was the maid. The maid's position in the corridor. The dowager's personal maid had been in the guest wing at a time when she had no domestic reason to be there. Lady Fenn's party had brought their own attendants. The guest wing should have been empty. The maid's presence there, at that specific moment, carrying a specific observation about a specific reticule, was too precise to be coincidence and too convenient to be accident. Someone had placed her there. Someone had known in advance that there would be a woman with a reticule in that corridor at that time. Miriam had written a letter, then another, then a third, to a woman she had known briefly during her time at Vane House, a housekeeper named Mrs. Crane, who had shown her a small act of kindness on the morning of the dinner, and who Miriam had repaid. Then by spending 40 minutes helping her correct a household ledger that had been badly kept. The correction had required no special talent. It had required patience and a knowledge of arithmetic that Mrs. Crane did not lack, but had not applied to the particular problem at hand. Mrs. Crane had thanked her with the particular warmth of someone who is grateful for being helped to do her job well, rather than grateful for being pitied. Miriam's letter asked Mrs. Crane nothing about the family and nothing about the jewels. It asked only one question about the maid, whether she had given notice within the month following the ruby's disappearance. She had. Sarah Trent had given notice 3 weeks after the theft was reported, citing a position in the country. No further address had been left. The dowager had been displeased, but had not pursued the matter. Miriam had sat with this information for 3 days. Then she had made one further inquiry through a solicitor's clerk she paid 6 shillings to make a single visit to a pawnbroker's in Cheapside. The clerk returned with a description of a velvet case, 4 pieces of matched ruby jewelry in antique gold filigree settings, offered for sale by a young woman answering to a description that matched Sarah Trent in the week before Christmas. The pawnbroker had declined to purchase them. The stones had been too fine and the provenance too uncertain. The case had been retrieved, and the young woman had not returned. The rubies had then arrived at Vane House by anonymous post in January. Mrs. Crane had confirmed this, in the second exchange of letters, with the particular precision of a woman who keeps good records, and was glad, now, to have kept them. The rubies had been quietly restored to the dowager's dressing room. No announcement had been made. No formal retraction of the household's conclusion had been offered. The dowager had known the rubies were back. She had chosen not to say so. Miriam had read this letter sitting at her small table with the evening light coming in through the better glazed of the two windows, and she had understood, then, the full shape of what had been done. The rubies had not been stolen. They had been moved and planted as evidence, and moved back when the evidence had served its purpose. The maid had been paid. The maid had been relocated. The whole mechanism had been clean and quiet, and calibrated to a specific outcome. And the outcome it had been calibrated to was the removal of Miriam Ashby from proximity to Edmund Vane. What the Dowager had not known, or had known and dismissed, was that the rubies were not hers to use as a mechanism. They were Miriam's. Her grandmother had worn them. Her grandmother had left them to her mother, and her mother to her, with Lady Fenn as trustee, because Miriam had been 11 years old at the time, and there was no one else. Lady Fenn had kept them in good faith, and kept no record that the Dowager had seen, and the Dowager had seen the rubies, and had known their history, and had used them as a weapon without fully knowing what weapon she was putting into Miriam's hands. Miriam had written to the Dowager Countess of Vane, not to ask for anything. She had stated, in plain, clear sentences, what she knew, what she could document, and what she believed any reasonable person would conclude. She had enclosed the pawnbroker's record. She had enclosed Mrs. Crane's letters, with Mrs. Crane's permission. She had stated that she intended to attend the Renshaw ball on the 14th of March, and that she intended to wear the rubies. She had not asked for permission. She had received, on the 4th day, a response in Edmund Vane's own hand. It was 4 sentences. It said, "The rubies will be at the door of your residence at 7 o'clock on the 14th. I have read your account. I am not in the habit of revisiting decisions I have made. I find, in this case, that I am unable to do otherwise." She had set that letter carefully in the small box she kept for papers of consequence, next to her father's last letter and a pressed sprig of heather from the garden of the house she had grown up in. Then she had begun to dress. The ballroom had not yet understood what it was witnessing. There was a murmur now, a texture in the air. The way a room sounds when it is trying to locate a piece of information it is certain it already has, but cannot immediately find. Miriam descended the staircase at the pace her father had taught her, not too slow, which is performance, and not too fast, which is fear. The rubies were warm at her throat. The Dowager Countess of Vane stood near the fireplace with Lady Cecily at her side. As Miriam crossed the floor, she watched the Dowager's face complete a journey that must have been very long and very expensive for a woman of her pride, moving from certainty to calculation to a specific, controlled absence of expression that was itself a kind of admission. The Dowager's fan stilled in her hand. She did not speak. Lady Cecily, who was a woman of genuine beauty and genuine correctness, turned slightly toward the terrace, not in contempt, but in the particular grace of knowing when one has been placed in a position that was never, in fact, about oneself. "That fixture again," said Mrs. Alderton, to someone near her, before she had fully understood what she was looking at. The someone near her did not respond, because the someone near her was looking at the rubies and was doing the arithmetic. And the arithmetic was arriving at an answer Mrs. Alderton had not yet reached. Edmund Vane crossed the ballroom floor. He walked without hurrying. He walked without looking at the room. He was looking at Miriam, and she was looking back at him. And the distance between them closed in the way of something that has been too long kept at a measured remove. He stopped in front of her. The room had not yet found the words it needed. He said, without any preamble, "I owe you a more public accounting than a 4-sentence letter." "You do not owe me a scene," she said. "I did not come for one." "No," he said. "You came for something else entirely. He looked at the rubies at her throat for a moment, not as a man looks at jewelry, but as a man looks at evidence, and at what that evidence cost. Then he looked back at her face. "They were always yours to wear," he said. "I should have known that before you had to prove it." The room heard this. The room had gone very quiet at some point in the last 30 seconds and had not announced it. And now a dozen people were very carefully not looking at them in the particular way of people who are recording everything. Miriam said, "I did not come to shame you." "I know," he said. "That is one of the several things I should have seen 8 months ago." He offered her his arm. Miriam Ashby looked at Edmund Vane's arm, and then at his face, and then, for one moment, at the rubies at her own throat. She took his arm. The room exhaled. "This is Miss Ashby," Edmund said, to no one in particular and to everyone. "She will be accompanying me this evening." It was 11 words. It was not a declaration. It was not a speech. It was simply the announcement of a fact the room was now required to accommodate, delivered with the quiet authority of a man who had made a decision and did not intend to revisit it. The Dowager heard it. Her chin lifted a degree. Then it settled, and something in her face passed from calculation into a reluctant, private recognition. The expression of a woman who has been managing outcomes for 40 years and has just encountered the one outcome she did not engineer. She was not destroyed by it. She was corrected. There is a difference, and she knew it. And in knowing it, she was, perhaps, the most honest she had been all evening. Edmund led Miriam to the far end of the room, near the terrace doors, where the orchestra had resumed playing, as though nothing had interrupted them. Because orchestras learn very early to ignore the things that happen in the spaces between their notes. "The letter," Miriam said, once they were a sufficient distance from the nearest pair of ears. "The 4 sentences. Badly insufficient," he said. "I was not asking for a better letter," she said. "I was asking what it cost you to write it." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said at last, "died in November, 3 years ago. I rode through the night. I did not arrive in time." He said it with the particular economy of someone who has rehearsed a sentence until it contains only its essential bones. "After that, I found it easier not to trust quickly, not to look too closely at the people near me. It seemed safer. It was not safe. It was merely a habit I had named safety." Miriam said nothing for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "About Clara. I know you did not take the rubies," he said. "I think I knew before I read your letter. I know that is not exculpatory." "No," she said. "It is not. I am asking," he said carefully, "whether it might be the beginning of something other than a reckoning." She looked at him. The terrace doors were open an inch, and the March air came through cold and clean, and the candlelight was warmer here, and the rubies at her throat were exactly what they were, the evidence of a wrong and the instrument of its correction, both at once. "In time," Miriam said, "is a beginning." He exhaled, slowly. "Then I will not waste it," he said. In the weeks that followed, the season revised itself. It did this without announcement, the way it always does, through the accumulation of small signals that are each individually deniable and, together, unambiguous. Invitations arrived with her name on them. Lady Fenn sent a letter of apology that was long and self-exculpatory, and which Miriam read once and set aside without reply. Mrs. Alderton did not apologize, and did not need to. The solicitor who had conducted the original inquiry received a formal statement correcting the record. Sarah Trent had moved to Norfolk. She was not pursued. The Dowager had paid her fare. The Dowager herself did not apologize. She would not. She was a woman whose sense of herself was organized around the conviction that she had always acted for correct reasons, and this was not entirely wrong. She had acted for the family. That what she had understood was incomplete did not mean her intentions were simple. Miriam did not require her to become a different person. She required only that the record be clear and the rubies be hers. On an evening in April, when the light had turned to that particular English gold that is impossible to accurately remember and impossible not to try, Edmund Vane called at Miriam's lodgings and asked her to walk with him in the small park at the end of the street. It was a perfectly proper thing to do. It was also the first time he had come without a formal occasion attached to the visit, and they both understood this, and neither mentioned it. They walked for an hour. The elms along the park's eastern border had just broken into leaf, the new green so vivid against the gold light that it had the quality of something slightly too true to be comfortable, the way certain moments do when they arrive, and you understand that you have been waiting for them without having known you were waiting. They talked about her father's books, and she had been working through his copy of A Natural History of the British Isles, the one with the hand-colored illustrations of birds that she had memorized as a child and returned to now with the different attention of someone who is finally still enough to see what is in front of her. Edmund had read the same work. He had found it, he said, shortly after his wife's death, which was not a thing she had expected him to volunteer. And the fact of the volunteering sat between them with a specific weight she did not attempt to handle carelessly. They talked about the specific qualities of grief that do not diminish with time, but do, eventually, change their texture. He had the miniature in his pocket. She knew it without having to look, because she had learned his habit of putting his hand briefly to the left breast of his coat when a certain quality of feeling arrived in him. And the habit was present now, just for a moment, before his hand returned to his side. He did not take the miniature out. Some things are carried and carry us in return, and the carrying is not the same as being trapped. Some things are simply what we are made of. And the man who puts his hand to his breast pocket on a spring evening is not a man diminished by what is inside it. He is a man who has learned to carry his grief without requiring the world to carry it for him, which is, in the end, the only kind of bearing that sustains. He asked her, as they were turning back towards the gate, whether she had considered what she would do next. The question was not anxious. It was the question of someone who has a stake in the answer, and is asking honestly rather than asking toward a particular response. "I have several offers," she said. "Households requiring a companion, a position in Bath." She felt him wait. She said, before he could ask, that none of them were quite right. He looked at her. The light was very gold. "I have a household," he said, "that is in considerable need of someone who has the particular combination of intelligence, composure, and willingness to collect evidence that you have demonstrated. That is," she said, "the strangest proposal I have ever heard." "It is the only kind I know how to make," he said. Honestly. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not handsome in the way the season designed for, not polished and not arranged. He was the kind of face that had been lived in. There was a quality to his attention now that she had first glimpsed in a library in November and had not expected to encounter again, and she understood that she had been wrong about that expectation. "I will need the rubies formalized," she said, "in writing, through a proper solicitor." "Done," he said. "Tomorrow, if you prefer." "I do prefer," she said. "Then tomorrow," he said. And then, lower, with the careful quality of a man placing something fragile in someone else's hands, he said her name. Miriam. Her name in his mouth was a different object than it had been in anyone else's. She had known that it would be. From the first time she had understood he was looking at her across a drawing room, and she had not permitted herself to dwell on it. Because there was nothing useful to be said about a thing that had no practical future. The body knows what it knows. What Miriam's body had known since November had not been altered by 8 months of a rented room and lessons at a kitchen table and a window she had fixed with oilcloth. "Yes," she said. "Tomorrow." They walked back to her lodgings in the particular silence of two people who have said enough and know it. At the door he paused. He looked at her for a moment with that quality of attention that had no name she had been given for it in any of her father's books. And then he turned and walked back down the street. And she watched him go. She went inside and removed the rubies from their velvet case and held the necklace in both hands for a long moment. The stones were warm, the way things are warm after they have been held close to a body for a long time. The gold filigree was not heavy. Her grandmother had worn them to her own wedding 60 years ago, and they had sat in various boxes since, and been argued over and moved about as instruments of other people's purposes, and they had come at last to the hands they were always supposed to reach, not through coincidence, not through someone's mercy. Through 8 months of methodical, unannounced work at a kitchen table by a woman who had been told she was a domestic fixture and had responded by becoming, quietly, the most dangerous kind of witness to her own worth. She set them back in their case and closed the lid. Outside, the April light was finishing its long argument with the evening, and somewhere a piano in the building above had begun to play, not well and not seriously, but with the earnest quality of someone who had recently decided that they wanted very much to learn. Miriam stood in her small room and listened to it, and something in her chest that had been held very tightly for a very long time was, in the particular unhurried way of things that take their time, slowly beginning to let go. If Miriam's quiet patience moved you tonight, if the particular courage of a woman who does not declare her worth but simply goes about proving it felt like something you needed, leave a word in the comments. There is more waiting for you here. She wore the rubies because she knew the truth, and the truth, in the end, did not need permission to be seen.